Well, thank you everyone for sticking around and with the Q&A. I'm here with the director, Prano or Prano?
Prano, like soprano without the so.
Okay, Prano Bailey Bond, director of both Nasty, the short film which you saw beforehand, and Censor. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this Q&A today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having Censor and Nasty at the festival.
Well, for those people here who might not quite know about the Video Nasty Panic, can you give us just a quick brief introduction to it?
Yes, so it was kind of early 80s Britain, basically, when VHS, the birth of VHS kind of meant that all of the films that were not being shown in the cinemas because they were sort of, not cinema films, these kind of horror films suddenly became available on VHS to view in the home. And censors, politicians, the media, society started to believe that because these films were available in the home, they were going to kind of destroy our minds in the UK and turn us all into murderers. And in particular, the censors were worried about the fact that you could watch VHS, rewind it and watch again. And the fact that they could study, how to garrote somebody or axe someone's head off. But basically there was like a kind of moral panic in the UK around that time, around what these films would do to young people and the whole of society, essentially. And just to add to that, actually, what happened was, they banned a bunch of films, the 72 banned list, and what that became was kind of like a holy grail for the horror fan to be like, oh wow, these films are going to ruin my mind and be terrifying. Of course, that's what every horror fan is looking for. So a lot of those films on that banned list probably wouldn't be remembered today if it weren't for the fact that they were banned.
Yeah, and that list is available on the internet. So if anyone wants to go through that list, they certainly can sort it out and find it. I think some, like you're right, some of those films are kind of dubious attributions to that list at best.
Yeah.
So I'm going to guess that you maybe were a little too young or maybe not yet born during the panic, but could you talk a little bit about how you discovered the Video Nasty era and your kind of journey into the horror genre?
Yeah, so I was born in the early 80s, so I was very young. Obviously, when all of this was going on, I didn't experience it in the way that kind of, a lot of the horror community in the UK that I know who are a bit older, that they were all creating fanzines and, doing kind of illegal video sales and illegal screenings. And that sounds fun, but I was like 5, so obviously I wasn't going to that. But the first kind of memory I have of censorship was when we'd been to the video shop, me and my mum, and we rented a 12, and I was probably about 8. And it was the first time I'd seen this guy called Simon Bates pop up in front of a video, and he kind of introduced the classification of the film. So he popped up like in a suit and said, it is an offence for anybody under the age of 12 to watch this film. Do not ask people to break the law and this kind of thing. And I was like, oh my God, I'm breaking the law by watching this film. They're going to, come to our tiny little house in Wales in the middle of nowhere and arrest my mum or take me and put me in prison. So I was really scared to watch the film because I thought I was going to get my mum in trouble, which of course she explained I wouldn't. And if I wanted to watch the film, I could anyway. I did. I was 8 and I was watching a lot of films that were kind of beyond my age range in that sense. So I watched the film and I knew it wasn't real. So it didn't scare me. It didn't disturb me. So, and it's funny, through Censor, I kind of remembered that experience and thought, even at that age, I could tell the difference between fiction and reality, that a horror film is not real. So it's safe for me to be scared in that space. But Simon Bates, this man, was very real and authority was very real. But then in terms of the Video Nasties, I mean, because I was in the middle of nowhere, a lot of the more obscure titles didn't reach me there. So it was mainly the better known ones that, things like Suspiria, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then The Evil Dead is one through, The Evil Dead wasn't actually a Video Nasty, but it was heavily cut in the UK. and that was when I was obsessed with that film as a teenager, to the point where when I went and studied theatre, I actually did a play based on The Evil Dead called Kill Her If You Can, Loverboy. And so, I mean, I kind of grew up with like a sprinkling of access to these films. And then when I moved to London, sort of in my late, just before my 20s, I was able to find kind of other films, and sort of slowly started to get access to more obscure things. And now a lot of them you can find on the internet. So that's it.
Was it ever a time when it was you specifically studied them, or you were like it was like this month, or like so many of us during lockdown have had our little pet projects? We were talking before we started recording about you growing plants and everything. Was there ever a time like in your, like, say, early college days when you were like, yeah, I'm just gonna, you bowled through like 40 of those in a short amount of time? Did you ever do that kind of list searching kind of thing?
Yeah, I think kind of that was more in my 20s. And then, to be honest, kind of all the way through, I had the idea for Censor quite a long time ago, and sort of it was sitting with me. So, it started with censorship, but I very quickly positioned the film in the Video Nasty era. And that gave me, like, I was already fascinated by these films and anything that was an uncut version of something. But then studying things for a film project makes it more like research. So you can feel like you're working while you're watching Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. So I think Censor like accelerated that. But yeah, it definitely kind of started in my sort of mid to late 20s, I think.
So I was really happy to include Nasty, which was your first, well, not your first short film, but we screened it back at SIFF in 2016, and it's kind of not really a prequel, but kind of a kin to, a child to Censor. Could you talk a little bit about the short film and how it developed and influenced and informed Censor?
Yeah, so I had the idea for Censor first, and then whilst developing the treatment for Censor, I thought it would be great to make a short film that allowed me to sort of explore some of these ideas and kind of bring the world of the film that I imagined to life a bit, explore the Video Nasty era. And I had this idea about a kid discovering video nasties for the first time. And I think that was really because, within the moral panic around these films, children were one of the biggest concerns in terms of like how will it affect the next generation, and in 10 years will we have a bunch of kind of psychopaths on the streets in the UK because they've grown up watching these horror films. And so I felt like there's so many stories during that era, it almost seemed that Nasty could be another story that was going on in the UK at the same time as Censor. And I think, some of the things that I was exploring, like some of the visual elements moving through the television, and, this kind of the idea of someone moving from like grey British suburbia into this like lurid, colourful world of the Video Nasties, that I was exploring that idea really. How do I get a character from this kind of bleak grey world into something that's bright and colourful and through the TV, essentially? So there were visual ideas like that. And then actually the family story thread, we developed that in Nasty, me and Anthony Fletcher, who I co-wrote both with. And that felt like such a nice through line into the Video Nasty world. So we wanted to make that work in the feature as well.
And your film kind of takes place at a very crucial moment in the British film world, because the BBFC, which was the British Board of Film Censorship, becomes the British Board of Film Classification right around the time that that censor takes place. Can you talk a little bit about your research into the BBFC, when it was the censorship brand, when it was under the censorship entity, and the kind of the practices that they engaged in at that time?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of research, that was one of the first places we started. I got in touch with the BBFC and asked if me and my co-writer could go in and talk to them. And there was a really lovely examiner working there called David Hyman, who had worked at the BBFC during this period. He wasn't a censor at that point, he is now, but him and his colleague chatted to us, and they were super knowledgeable, super helpful. But also we got to book out files, so you could like book out the file for Texas Chainsaw, Evil Dead, and actually read through the film censor's notes and see how they were approaching it. And what was fascinating about this was that you started to see the individual censors' personalities coming through in the way they were approaching the films. So you'd never get their full name, you'd just get their initials on the file, but you're starting to go, that sounds like the person who said this about, you know, Last House on the Left. And so you kind of start to go, oh, she's a real stickler for the rules, and you know, this guy is obsessed with the male id, and you know, it's like, it was really interesting to kind of see how their tastes and attitudes to life and politics and everything inflected in the way that they were watching these films. And also to be in the space, because even though the film isn't set in the BBFC, we always made it, you know, an imaginary censor's office in a way. And the films within the film are the ones that are part of the narrative are all made up titles. So we wanted to take it slightly out of reality, so it doesn't become this kind of historic fact-checking piece of work. But still being in that space was really helpful, because there's like an underground basement area, which is where we were reading the files, and the rooms are very small and it just felt very claustrophobic. So I kind of, you know, that all fed into the production design. But then equally, I spoke to a couple of film censors who'd worked during that period, and one of them had told me, you know, she didn't really like horror films for a start, so she didn't feel that comfortable watching all this stuff, but also they had to watch things that were maybe more of a sexual nature. And she said sometimes she'd feel that she was just sitting in this tiny little claustrophobic room in the dark with no windows watching soft porn, and she'd leave work feeling really grubby. And I just loved that kind of, you know, you kind of take that kind of statement and you can feed it into the aesthetic and the feel, and it brings it to life. I equally spoke to censors who loved horror and understood the need for horror, and felt it was like an essential thing, and it was something we need in our lives, which was really interesting. But so yeah, that was a lot of the research on that side.
Yeah, and if people are interested in this a little bit more, the BBFC have their own podcast, and some of the earlier episodes do detail some of the case studies for some of the films, like Alien is one and Gremlin, and how they got passed at certain classifications. So if you enjoyed Censor, I would recommend checking some of those early episodes out for viewers. One of the film's executive producers is Kim Newman, who wrote the book on horror, and I mean, he literally wrote one of the best books on horror. And a lot of horror fans will know his name because he's just so knowledgeable. Can you talk a little bit about how he helped helped with the film, and kind of the background of the Video Nasties and the films that you allude to in the movie?
I met Kim, God, I don't know how long ago, probably over a decade ago, through a short film I did called Short Lease, that he selected for a film festival, you know, not knowing him, and then, you know, invited us to his birthday party, me and one of the other people who made the film. And that was how I met him. And he became a really good friend, and we'd often go to the cinema. Until COVID happened, we were going to the cinema together quite frequently. So he was a huge support in Nasty. And and he's actually in Nasty for the beady-eyed people. He's on the front cover of the newspaper being arrested by the police, with the Merchants of Menace title. And I think the label on the videos is also Kim's Video Dungeon. It doesn't say Kim, but it's the Video Dungeon, which is his column that he wrote. And so when we were kind of putting the treatment together, obviously Kim is kind of like the godfather of the video nasties. He's a walking encyclopedia, and just a wealth of knowledge about this period. So I approached him and said, would you like to be an executive producer? And he said he would be very happy. And in terms of how, I think one of the things, like, he'd often suggest films to look at through the process of writing. He'd be like, oh, have you seen Extra? Or and we talked quite a bit about the fact that I wanted to make Frederick North a British director, but actually the directors of the Video Nasties were predominantly Italian and American, and, you know, there were pretty much no British directors. So, you know, he was kind of suggesting films that might help me anchor, you know, that British director in Frederick North, you know, that kind of is making these kind of films. David Hyman was also helpful. He kind of suggested looking at like Norman J. Warren and Pete Walker and things. So yeah, he read drafts of the script, and he saw cuts of the film as we were going through, and that kind of thing, and sort of executive producer type stuff.
So much of the film, of course, comes down to Enid's experiences. So let's talk about Niamh Algert, who plays Enid. How did she come to be involved with the project? Was it an audition, kind of a casting call audition, or did you know her previously and have her in mind? Or talk about bringing her into the fold.
Yeah, I did meet her previously, but we were on a scheme called the Screen International Stars of Tomorrow, where they select a group of filmmakers and a group of actors and say, these are going to be the stars of tomorrow. And that was in 2018. So I'd met her at that and became aware of her. And then it wasn't until my casting director, Nanu Rowlands, we'd kind of just begun the casting process, and she said, Niamh Algert's agent has been in touch, you know, and heard about the project. And I was like, oh, I met her. That's interesting. So I went, and at the time there was a series that was kind of her big first thing that like kind of shot her into, you know, the UK sort of scene. And that was a TV series called The Virtues by Shane Meadows. And she was incredible in it, like just really breathtaking. And I was like, wow, this person's special. And I watched pretty much everything I could find, and she was so different in everything. And then she came in and read, and yeah, we, you know, obviously she was amazing. And we had a couple of times where she'd come in and it was actually like, I remember the first time she came in and read, and she just totally made emotional sense of, you know, like it's very complicated what Enid's going through, and there's a lot of stuff kind of that she's saying, but there's so much other stuff going on underneath, and she never really says things that openly. And I really felt that Niamh had that nuance to kind of tune into that, which was the first thing that made me feel like she's the one. And then she read the later scenes, and I could just see how, you know, she had this kind of way of, she could do the coiled sort of spring, the repressed Enid at the front, but then where she took it emotionally in terms of the later scenes was, yeah, very exciting. Even in the auditions, I was pretty blown away, and I thought, yes, this person can carry the film.
And she's in pretty much every scene in the movie, if I remember correctly, except for some of the Video Nasty recreations that you're doing. Is that, am I remembering that correctly? Okay. And kind of one of the things I think you really did brilliantly in the film is her character narrative arc, where she starts off as someone who has to be an objective viewer and then becomes through the course of the film a very subjective view of reality. And we realize as an audience that we've been seeing the film through her eyes. It's kind of a first person limited view into the world. Can you talk a little bit about collaborating with Neve to achieve that?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you've broken it up like that, the objective and subjective, because that was something that actually came from the research. And when I spoke to this film examiner who'd worked during the time, and she said that when they watched the films, they had to be both objective and subjective at the same time. And Enid is objective at the front. It's like she's holding her feelings at bay.
Yeah,
You know,
there's that
she's got
scene where
this shell.
they're counting the number of incidences, and that's what they're like debating whether if it's going to get an 18 or 15 or whatever
Yeah,
dividing
exactly. Yeah, and then it's breaking that shell basically through the film, and then obviously when she watches Don't Go in the Church, she becomes entirely subjective to the point where she's not seeing the film that everybody else is seeing. Like you say, we're seeing it through her eyes. And I mean, in terms of how me and Neve worked, we actually spent a lot of time talking months in advance of the shoot. She was shooting in Cape Town, so we were Skyping kind of once or twice a week and just talking about Enid. And it's like, I suppose you know, as a writer, you've been writing this character for ages and you feel like you know them so well. But then I think that casting is really almost the next stage of writing the character, where you're kind of giving all your ideas over to the actor and then bringing their ideas of the character and sort of fusing them and pushing the character into the next, realm. And so I suppose that was what we were doing on those Skypes, and you'd talk about, your own experiences and Enid and weird things that have happened to you. And we kind of, even I always wanted a detail, like a physical detail that Enid would do throughout, like an anxious thing. And Neve was like, oh, I could just pick my finger. Like she said, that's something she knew people did when that this just picking at yourself. And I was like, that's amazing, this kind of destroying yourself almost. So that was something that came through those conversations. So by the time we kind of got to even like rehearsals in person, when Neve was finally in London, we'd done so much of the work already. Then it was more about the physicality and how that kind of starts and breaks down, because she starts very, upright and organized physically, and then she becomes more and more chaotic as her kind of mind becomes more chaotic. So we kind of work through that in the room. And then on set, we're just talking all the time about Enid, just very, in tune with one another and focusing on what you're trying to achieve from scene to scene, I think. And it's hard to remember exactly, because the shoot, you're just like getting through the scenes. But I know, like, it felt like sometimes it's just me and Neve, just like kind of zoned in with each other. And it was great because we had such great communication. I remember sometimes I'd give her a note and she'd just be like, yeah, I know. Yeah. Like it's almost like we were thinking of the same things at the same time sometimes, or I'd tell her and she just knew what I meant. And so that was amazing.
You, woman director, if I remember reading some of the press notes correctly, a lot of the department heads were women as well. Can you talk about, well, I guess I wanted to draw this into, because the film has that kind of grungy look of the VHS era. Talk a little bit about, your art director, set director, costuming, cinematography, how they all kind of contributed to that look of the film.
Yeah. So my DOP, my cinematographer, Annika Summerson, I've worked with her. Well, we met in university, so we've known each other for a really long time. And she's shot most of my work, not everything, but the majority. And she shot Nasty as well. So when we were looking at like how to bring that to life visually, we were looking at a lot of kind of 80s films and also contemporary films that were set during the 80s, and we really felt that shooting on film was going to help us with the look, just that authenticity of the period, rather than shooting digitally and then trying to light it and make it look like film in post. So I think that decision was a big factor. And then obviously you're kind of always showing, communicating about, I'd always tell Annika about this kind of colour journey that we did in Nasty as well. So she really worked we kind of had this palette which was across production design, costume and cinematography, where we have a colour palette that we kind of start in, and then we have a colour palette of where we're going. And so you might have all kind of blues and things at the beginning, and then you go into a dream and you might introduce pink light in the dream, and then when you come out of the dream you introduce pink light in Enid's real world. So it's almost like you're slowly weaving ideas, both props and the note, for example, but also techniques like how the camera moves and the lighting, sort of slowly weaving to create this journey, I guess, from reality into fiction that's slower and not like suddenly kind of turned on the fiction light and you're in that world. So we worked really closely on that. And then Paulina Zuzewska, whose surname I'm terrible at pronouncing, I met her just before we kind of made the film. So I met her because of the project, and she just I remember the first conversation we had, and she was like, just completely understood Enid. It was amazing. And all her ideas were about the character and about like channeling Enid into the design and how we do that and how we create reflections and things like that within images. And so she brought so much. She's just so talented and hardworking. And then and Saffron Kalaim as well. So my costume designer, it felt like that trio, the production design, costume and cinematography, we were very united. Saffron I've known for a long time, and she's worked on some of my pieces before. But again, we were talking a lot about how we kind of make Enid fit the world of the census office with her costume. The colours are like the same colours as the walls, and then she might come in later and she's wearing something red that is very subtle stuff that just means she's sort of slowly breaking away from that world. But yeah, it's kind of just bringing those people together and really throwing all our ideas together. And you always have way more ideas than you can actually do in the film. You're in pre-production, you're like, and then slowly things have to be let go as the like logistics and time set in. But they were an incredible team and all picked. It's funny because they are all women and there were other women on the project, but I didn't even think about it when I was, casting my crew. It was just, these are the people that I think are going to be the best in these roles, that they're the ones that understand the film and are amazingly talented. So that was what led me to them, really.
And you mentioned the color scheme, and I wanted to get to touch on that in regards to how the film ends, because it reminded me, what you were doing there reminded me of Argento in Suspiria, and how he kind of takes Snow White, Disney Snow White, and turned that into the color palette for that film. And if you watch the two back to back, it's kind of real mind trip. But the film seems to become this kind of amalgamation of VHS tracking versus with Grimm's Brothers Grimm fairy tale going into the woods and all. And I was just wondering if you could, discuss that for a little bit.
Yeah, so the kind of Video Nasty section, I mean, I think Lucio Fulci and Argento were both big inspirations because I just love the aesthetic of their work. And obviously you're leaning into the Video Nasty, the Video Nasties, because that's what Enid's kind of entering at that point. So they were, both huge inspirations, but then also the very ending where we kind of move into, you know, Enid's fantasy ultimately. That was it was inspired by a few different things, and you know, obviously just you're taking the character to a certain place because of what you're talking about as a filmmaker as well. But opera was one film I remember watching while I was writing, and the end of that film, when the spoiler alert, the killer gets arrested, and then suddenly we're in this kind of perfect world where everything's fine, and you're like, she watched loads of people get murdered, she's probably quite traumatized, but she's fine. And you know, and I kind of loved that kind of forced happy ending in that film, which I think there's a few films, other films like that, that were really helpful to watch. But yeah, that kind of grungy aesthetic is definitely, like, texture was a huge part of thinking about the film in general, and that's kind of why we wanted to shoot on film, because one of the things that, you know, people would say about the Video Nasty era in particular was that you'd get like these kind of multi-generation VHS copies of something like Cannibal Holocaust, and then you get to the bit that was, you know, the really horrible bit, and it got more scuzzy because people had rewound it and watched it again and rewound it and watched it again, so you'd get kind of snowy. And I think it's got that sort of CD like look, hasn't it? That CD texture VHS in that way, and it's so of a time that it kind of had to be part of the film, and was why I was, you know, I've never watched so much white noise in my life as making, you know, making Nasty and Censor. I've become a real, like, you're talking to VFX artists, and you're like, no, this kind of white noise, like this kind of scuzzy, you know, VHS distortion. Yeah, I've got a lot of videos of white noise.
All right. Well, we're just about near the end of our time, but can you tell us what projects you're working on next? Any tantalizing bits you can share, no matter how vague?
I think, well, it's very early days. I've just in the last few weeks started writing a new film, so it's probably a bit too early to talk about it. But it I guess, you know, it's kind of leaning. It's sort of psychological thriller territory. It's getting darker by the minute, so we'll see where it ends up. But definitely kind of want to stick in the world of nightmares, even if it's not full-blown horror. But yeah, working on a few new ideas.
Have you ever been to Seattle before? Are you familiar with Scarecrow Video? Have you heard of Scarecrow
No,
Video? Oh,
no.
it's just, okay. So you're gonna want to definitely Google Scarecrow Video and look at the images of inside the store. But it's this huge video store in Seattle. I think they claim to be the biggest video store in the world, and they probably have claim to that title. So any of our Seattle viewers can go and check out movies from them. So what Video Nazis would you recommend viewers seek out, either as influential to censor or as personal favorites to you?
Well, I mean, I'll say the obvious ones, which I've kind of already mentioned.
Evil
My
Dead.
favorite is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre now, even though it was Evil Dead as a teenager. I think now it's like, that is just pure dread. But that's quite well known. There's other films that maybe weren't on the banned list, but they were kind of involved in some way. So if you're looking for loosely around the Video Nasties, I'd say Basket Case is a lot of fun. The Witch Who Came from the Sea is an amazing, you know, piece of work. It's like really incredible film. Axe, or Lisa Lisa, that's another good one. But the film, it's not a Video Nasty, it's a bit earlier, but I always recommend it. It's my favorite horror film, is Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is from the 70s and wasn't in the Video Nasty list, but it's the best.
Great. Well, I just also want to remind people that you'll be joining us for our WT Femme roundtable on April 10th at 6:30 p.m. So everyone should check that out. I guess you're going to be up late that night. It's going to be like 2:30 in the morning for you.
Yeah, exactly.
So make yourself a good strong cup of tea or coffee. And thank you, Prano, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us. me and the film.